I'm just curious, we're exploring how AI can transform workflows and processes, both improving efficiency and introducing completely new ways of doing things. But when it comes to actually implementing these solutions, companies face a critical decision. Should they build a custom AI solution tailored to their needs, or should they buy an off-the-shelf AI product for faster deployment? This decision isn't just about cost. It's about scalability, customization, data ownership, and long-term flexibility. To help us break this down, I'm joined by Ross Hale and Mike McCormick of Artium, an AI-focused software development consultancy that helps organizations as varied as Red Bull, Disney, Mayo Clinic, and NASA build enterprise-safe products powered by AI. With deep expertise in AI development and strategy, they've helped businesses navigate the complexities of integrating AI into their operations. Today, we'll discuss the pros and cons of building versus buying AI solutions, when companies should consider AI development, and real-world examples of how businesses are making this choice. Ross and Mike, welcome to Just Curious.
Thank you, Stu. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So there are trade-offs between building AI-powered software from scratch versus buying a pre-built solution. What do you think is the biggest factor that determines whether a company should build or buy?
That's a good question. I think for me, there are obviously a lot of different factors, but the number one I would have to say is long-term strategic benefit. So, if this software that you're looking to either build or buy gives your company a capability that is going to be important to your end users, that is going to be important to driving strategic success of your business, especially if that success is long term, right? Especially if this is something where um, you're looking at a long horizon of being able to continually build on this capability. And I think a good, heuristic for that is the degree to which it's going to affect your end customer, that target customer that you're looking to serve as a business. If it's going to affect them, then building is really the way to go, right? Because ultimately you want to be able to control that experience. You want to be able to continue to, layer on improvements as time goes by, to continue to gain that competitive advantage, right? With that end user. And you want to own the IP as well. I think in that case, buying, you become so dependent on another company, on another group, even if they say that they will massively customize it for you, even if they are open to the idea of working with you to develop it in ways that you want, you're ultimately kind of at their mercy at the end of the day. Long term, you won't get that benefit of kind of the compounding return on investment from building it. So strategically important, affects your end user build. Buy is great if you're really just looking for an internal capability, if it's something that kind of checks a box, if it's really like, I kind of hate to say this, but the truth is, it might be that you just need to be able to say, hey, we're doing something with AI, right? We've got AI as part of our strategy, and it's more kind of a check the box type thing. That's where buying is probably right. Because the truth is that build path, it is a big undertaking. You're going to have to, have a team. You're going to have to, think about ongoing maintenance and ongoing improvements. And it really is kind of a long journey, kind of one that never ends, right? I think that's another thing that is still very true about AI software is, when building, it is very unlikely that you're going to kind of build a piece of software and then you're done in 6 months and you never touch it again, right? The more successful this thing is, the more you're going to continue to invest and add and drive forward. And that's kind of what you want your plan to be, because for anything worth building, it's probably worth iterating on. So hopefully that gives perspective. I think it's really about, first and foremost, the first question to ask is how strategically beneficial this is and how it will affect, or whether it will affect our end customer in a big way.
Yeah.
Mike, I'd love to hear
Yeah.
yours as
I,
well.
I think I have some related thoughts on that and some that are maybe a little bit different. I look at it in terms of, is the thing that you're working on able to create a top line revenue for you? Or does it differentiate how your products go to market and make money for the company? And if it's something that is really differentiating the way that you serve your customers or the way that you create products, then you're going to have a lot of your own sort of secret sauce bound up in the product itself. And that's a way that I think about, like, well, building probably gives you a lot more flexibility there than buying. If it's something that feels more like table stakes or a little more undifferentiated, hey, it's part of the way we do business. That's where you might reach for a vendor for doing those kind of things. And for me, the other way that I think about it is sort of how well defined is the problem you're trying to solve. if you can sort of say, if we can do then, and we did that better, that would solve a host of issues we have. If it's really well defined, you can also go evaluate the offerings that are out there and see if they sort of fit what you're able to define. If it's relatively undefined, but you understand you need to do it, custom software is really a good path to go. Because you can work down the how do we sort out the problems in the space while we're building the thing. It's very difficult to do that with a vendor relationship.
Yeah. What about cost? I have to imagine that one of the common conversations you have with clients and potential clients is around the cost of custom software. And while buying an AI solution might seem cheaper upfront, over time, that may not be the case. It could become more expensive due to scaling costs, API calls, vendor lock-in, other things. How should companies think about the total cost of ownership when making this decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's funny. I always feel like instead of thinking about just cost, you should really be thinking about investment, because it's about what's that return on investment you're making. If you have something that is going to affect your business in a big way, and there's effectively that compounding return on investment that I was talking about, or the potential for that, you'd want to invest more money, right, to get a bigger return at the end of the day. I think that the truth is, building custom, it is going to oftentimes be significantly more expensive total cost of ownership over time than paying, effectively renting. We say build versus buy, but these days, most of the time it's build versus rent.
Right.
You're paying SaaS subscriptions or something like that. So, ultimately, I think you need to look at it as an investment model. And if it's not an investment model, if this really is just a purely, kind of OpEx thing that you're not anticipating is going to move the needle in the business in a big way, but just as kind of a check the box thing, then to your point, I think that's where um, building makes sense. So for the buy model, you have to really model out the whole return on investment over time that you're looking for. I think another note on cost is that we've become accustomed in tech to thinking about the compute as commodity and effectively free, at least in the short term. For many use cases, um, the cost of inference, the cost of actually running your AI can be quite significant. Now, the caveat to the caveat is that that cost comes down quickly as new models are released. So over time, you can expect that similar levels of inference will rapidly decrease in cost. But usually at launch, you have to really factor in that compute cost. Whereas I think for many use cases, at least in the world of cloud and SaaS, you could effectively treat your hosting as commodity cost, right? In this case, inference is much more expensive. This is an asterisk. But yeah, Mike, I'd love to pass it to you.
Yeah, I'll just pick up right there. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions in terms of how do we drive that cost down over time. Some of that is in control of folks on your team. If you're building custom software, how do we swap out models? Where do we host it? What does that mean for us? How do we do things? Can we use a smaller model once we've developed what we need to do? Can we move from a big giant thing to a smaller one that is more cost effective? A lot of that's pretty unknown from a pattern perspective at this point. A lot of that's pretty unknown from a energy or resource driven perspective of running the models themselves. I think people have become really accustomed to that, the cloud provider costs and the cost of ownership for building custom software or buying or renting packaged software, right? And I do think there are some things that are sort of open-ended question marks over the next 3 years that I think we're at a place where building these will start to make it more concrete and answer some of the questions and reveal some of the patterns. And so 2-3 years from now, it might be much easier to understand what total cost of ownership is on custom software versus AI or versus, renting it. I think as you rent it, you're assuming that the vendor is going to be able to bring their own costs down and make that more affordable. I think that piece that Ross didn't talk about that is also part of cost of ownership that I think of is the rollout. Analogize it to when mobile first started to come out and people didn't really understand, what does that mean? Because people that hadn't used it in the workspace, let alone they were just trying to figure it out in their personal lives. And if you think about mobile adoption and trying to make something work and how many products were built and not used or like couldn't get rolled out correctly. And that was a thing that didn't really matter if it was build or rent, as it were. Like you could go get something and try to roll it out, and just that organization change necessary for people to adopt it, get use out of it, and kind of continue to continue to make it effective in the like original vision that it had, was really difficult. Lots of stuff fell by the wayside. And I think we're going to see a lot of that with AI as well, because I think the end users, the consumers of whatever it is you're building, they don't totally know how to do these things yet. And so one of the things I think is powerful about custom software here is that you have the ability to iterate custom software at a pace that you don't necessarily have the ability to iterate something that you rent or buy off the shelf, right? And so typically when you're buying software in and then deploying it, you're dealing with change management as part of that, but your change management is more like, this is what the vendor provides, so this is how I manage the change, versus I don't really understand how the users are going to work. Let me change my software as I learn about how the users are working. And I think those two things, that's a pretty different side of the dial when you think about it that way.
Yeah. And I guess a key point that I'm taking away from that answer, which ties into the first conversation we had, is that it's less about cost in a vacuum than it is about cost relative to return. And the returns from those two options are going to be quite different. And so one should consider not just the cost of ownership and not just the total cost of ownership, but also what does that cost unlock? Because to your point, Ross, it's an investment, not an expense, and there should be a return on the back end.
I can give
100%.
you.
It's like how much.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, how much would you budget for Bitcoin a decade ago? Like how much should you spend on that? Like all of it, right? You'd be like, how much money can I put in? And just be like, max it out because that return is going to happen. Now, in this case, you're making a bet on your own execution to a certain extent, and that you're correct that this is going to be a capability. But if you have something that's going to give you a return, yeah, you're gonna want to invest, right? Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, I can give a more concrete example. We're participating with a group of healthcare companies working through, how is AI getting deployed in healthcare? And one of the common conversations in there is it's well acknowledged that providers would love to have a dictation app, right? Like where they could take notes inside of the patient visit and then have access to really comprehensive notes thereafter. Well, if you think about it, like dictation apps have been highly available for 15, 20 years at this point. But what you had to do as an individual was put the investment time into the app to train it to understand how to listen to you, to understand what the things are that you're saying. A lot of folks were like, just not going to put the time in right there.
Yeah.
AI has made the amount of training, the amount of labor to do that much more effective, right? And so folks are hopeful, like, okay, well, with our new, with the AI future, would it be great if I can go, and this would be a rent because you don't need to buy. There's a number of companies out there that are trying to build this and make it effective because they understand it's a well understood problem space. Providers have it pretty universally. So there's lots of folks eager to kind of offer something in the space right there. And you got those rollout issues that you need to have. If nobody uses it, if nobody's like turning it on and making it work, you're going to turn off that contract eventually, right? So figuring that piece of it out is really important. And also, I think, like, to the point of, is it something that is affecting how you grow and how you expand? That's sort of a table stakes, like our patient care would be better here, but it really doesn't change top line revenue for a health system, right? They're sort of like, this is quality of life for our employees and for our customers, but really by bringing on this thing and managing it, all of that expense is sort of eaten internally, or like not obvious to articulate, right? As something, if you're either running at the top level of leadership at these health systems, right? Or if you're trying to communicate with your patients, how you start to articulate the value of this thing isn't really as clear.
In regulated industries like healthcare, but also finance, both areas that you and Artium are active, data privacy and ownership are huge concerns. We've discussed how building AI internally can allow for greater control over data handling and compliance. For a company that's considering AI adoption, how should data security and competitive advantage factor into that build versus buy or build versus rent decision?
Can I hop the line on this one, Ross? I got a really
Go for it.
got a burning desire to answer this one. So the thing I've seen that's the most interesting is that companies that have been in regulated industries for a long time already have governance in place for a lot of these things, right? Like AI ML isn't particularly new. Most of these places have had to figure out how do we deal with data classification? How do we deal with data usage? How do we, what sort of like data engineering, if you will, like how do we resolve around that? What do we do with models? How do we think about them? How do we validate that they're behaving the way they are? So they have governance in place for some of these things. The companies that are going to be the most effective as they do this are the ones that can modify those procedures the fastest, right? Like being able to change how you talk, because those groups are typically like compliance, legal, somebody in the office of the CIO who was once technical and is now, in the leadership chain there. Like there's a bunch of folks that are collaborating to get to the right answers or bless the projects or put constraints in place that are really effective there. This is true both for internal custom build initiatives and for buy or rent initiatives, right? Like what are we giving them? How does that, how does that data affect us? What would happen if there's a breach? What is the chain of custody for like the data ownership over there? All of this stuff is parts of the process. And the companies that take the perspective of staying rigid around what they have right now are going to be the ones really sort of looking like they stand still. And I'm not urging drop the ability to have this governance. What I am saying is that for the folks who are actively iterating on that governance and getting better at kind of the meta process of like talking about these things, making decisions about these things, rationalizing about them, are really going to outpace the folks that are putting their head in the sand and saying, I don't want to address it. I'm not mature enough to address it, or we don't address it at all, et cetera. So I think we're going to see like a growing gap over time of the people that said, okay, it's a cross-functional group. Now let's get together, and our job is to figure out how to create the fast lane and make sure that people can get in the fast lane and do their thing. But the fast lane has to remain safe, right? We don't want accidents all over the place. We don't want our name on the front page of the news. So what do we do to make that fast lane really effective for teams to get on and do the right thing?
Awesome. Gentlemen, this has been a great discussion on building versus buying and renting. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you again.
You bet.
Thank you, Stu.
Thanks for having us.